Unhurried spirit. Isn't that a lovely theme for this new service of worship? Unhurried. Isn't that what we really look for in our lives? A time of rest, of relaxing, of chilling in the summertime. So the next few weeks, we're going to be moving into the New Testament as part of our reading project of going through the Bible this year. And I think it's a great time for us to adjust the rhythm of our lives, to figure out where we're going and how we're getting there, and what our tempo is, what our rhythm is. Next slide. As many of you know, I've been on vacation for a couple weeks, and the first week I went backpacking on the Colorado Trail in Colorado. Now it's almost 500 miles long. My sister and I did about 25 miles, maybe 30, and we were at altitudes between about 7,000 and 8,300 feet. It was a lot. It was a heavy pack with all of our food and water. There were 2 days where there were no water stops on the trail, and so we had to carry enough water to get through 2 days and 10 miles of high altitude hiking through an area that had been burned out. So there was no trees and no shade in that area. My sister, regretfully, miscalculated her water, and she ended up carrying like 25 pounds of water, which was twice what she needed to carry, and she discovered that's a lot of weight to carry on the trail. But we all have mistakes. We all have to take time. One of the biggest things we learned was that there's a tempo when you're hiking that you have to find based on your own body, the altitude, the temperature, the weight you're carrying, whether you're going up or going down. And if you don't find the right tempo, you just feel terrible. And nothing works right. We have to be patient, and we have to find our own pace and rhythms. So as I was on this trail, I thought a lot about Jesus and Paul, because when you go through the New Testament, they walked everywhere. There were a few boats across the Sea of Galilee, maybe a few boats across the Mediterranean, but Paul and Jesus walked and walked and walked. And walking is a time to think, to spend time with God, to chat with your companions. And so I think as we start this, I want us to think about that walking that everyone in the New Testament did, and to see ourselves on that same spiritual journey of walking with them. So today I'd like to cover 3 points as we get started in the New Testament. I want to provide some context to the New Testament, especially for those who have been in the Hebrew Bible for so long. It can be a little bit jarring to have a new cultural context. And we're also going to talk a little bit about interpreting the Bible. So in the slide, you see one of the amphitheaters from the days that Paul was in Thessalonica. You can still go visit this today. Thessalonica is a booming, thriving city in Greece today. But Paul was living in a very particular time. And as we start in the New Testament, the first thing I want to say is that we're going to start with the 7 letters that we know Paul wrote himself. The reason we're doing this is this gives us a look into how our understanding of Jesus grew and how small faith communities grew into forces. We don't have absolute dates on every writing in the New Testament, but there's a strong consensus for most of the order of the writings, and that's what we're going to be following here. I believe Jane made some paper copies of the reading plan for this summer. It's also posted on Facebook and our website for anyone who wants to follow along. It may seem that we are jumping around the New Testament because the Bible did not put the books in the New Testament based according to chronological order. But I think that by doing this in the order they were written, we're going to get an insight into these early believers, into their growing understanding of who Jesus was and what his message means for the world. Which brings up the question, so what is the order that's in the Bible that we carry around? And it is kind of interesting. So in the Bible, the first 4 books are the Gospels, which tell us about the life of Jesus. Now, for someone who doesn't know anything about Jesus, this is important, putting the Gospels first. I think that was a good choice. Not that anyone asked me. And then comes the book of Acts, which is a history book of the early church. And then we have all these writings, these letters that went out to communities and people in the New Testament. The interesting thing there is that they decided to order them based on a letter to a community went first, and then the letters to individuals were second. And then they were all put in the order of how long the letters were. So basically, most of the New Testament is put together based on how long, how many words were in a letter. Now, you can think whatever you want about that ordering. It has worked for a long time. But for us reading through, one of the things, those of us who were reading through the prophets, we're like, this is jumping all over the place. Because the prophets in the Hebrew Bible were also not in chronological order. And a lot of us got very confused. Because there was stuff from before the Assyrians destroyed Israel, there was stuff from before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, and then we'd be in the Persian Empire a couple hundred years later, and then we'd jump back. It was very confusing. So for the New Testament, we're going to do a chronological read this summer, and just walk with the people as they came to understand this new understanding of God that Jesus had presented. As we start to read the New Testament letters, I want us to remember a couple things. One is we are eavesdropping on incomplete conversations. So when Paul starts writing to the Thessalonians, which was about 50 AD or Common Era, he'd already been there. He knew everyone there. He had already told them all about Jesus. They knew something about Jesus. They were living as a new faith community as Paul went on to talk to a new community. So there's a whole conversation that we don't have in writing because Paul said it in person and they all heard it. And then we get this one letter because he heard some things from a friend, so he writes him a letter. And there is a second letter, much, much later, which probably was not actually written by Paul. But we didn't really hear a response from the Thessalonians. We don't know what they thought of the letter they got from Paul. We don't know what happened after that letter. So we have an incomplete conversation that we're listening to. But I want us to remember that while they are incomplete conversations, the early church found these instructions very useful and relevant. There were lots of letters that got sent to lots of places, and we don't have all of them. Sometimes we have references to a letter that we don't have. For example, in 1 Corinthians, it's clear there was a pre-1 Corinthians, a first 1 Corinthians that we don't have. The Hebrew Bible has references to texts we don't have as well. But these texts were so meaningful to the early believers that they took the time to find someone who could write. They took the time to find someone who had enough money to buy some parchment, some papyrus. They took the time to hand copy these letters and send them on to other faith communities. They felt the Spirit moving in these letters, and they saved them, and they shared them. And I think that's where our inspiration from these letters is still founded. We can still feel the Spirit moving in them, and we can still share their wisdom. So the last bit of local context that I'd like to share, just so that we're really grounded as we start reading this. These early believers, we often call it the early church. But I don't know if it was really a church the way we think of a church. It was really not organized. By 50 AD, there were maybe 2,000, maybe 3,000 believers total across the Eastern Mediterranean. That's it. In any particular location, there were maybe 50 or 60 people. Jerusalem had maybe a few hundred. But we're not talking about large, organized groups of people. There's no institutional church. They don't have any rules for who's a pastor and what's a church and how to do communion and what to do with the offering. None of that exists yet. It's a bunch of people who are hungry for God's message, hungry for Jesus in their life. So that's the context of the early believers and this kind of a house church tradition. They really met in homes. There's also a Jewish context, because a lot of the early believers came from a Jewish background, or they first heard about God through Jewish people they knew. And the Jewish context that we need to remember is there were a lot of sub-traditions. Some of them we're familiar with from reading the Gospels, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There were some other groups called the Zealots. Judas, the betrayer, was a zealot. The Essenes were another group, and they were the ones who left us the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been so useful for us. So the Jewish community was not a monolithic, unified group of people, but they did have two core convictions that were a part of the early believers' understanding of where Jesus came from and what God was trying to do in the world. One was that the Jews had a very radical monotheism. Now that sounds like big seminary talk. What it means is they absolutely, totally, completely believed in only one God. Now they lived in a world of the Greek and Roman gods. The ancient Egyptian gods were still around. There were hundreds of gods with temples everywhere. And most people, kind of like donors to political parties today, most people gave a donation and a prayer to a lot of gods to cover all of their bases. You know, just like some companies give to both the Republicans and Democrats to make sure they're covered, they would worship Apollo and Isis and Venus, and, you know, the list goes on and on and on and on. Jews had one God, period. Which got them into some political trouble because there were a bunch of emperors who thought they were God. And so there were political and economic ramifications for this radical monotheism. The other conviction that the Jews had, that I think we still hold on to, is they had an absolute belief in the promise and hope that came from God's covenants with Abraham. They believed they were the children of Abraham, and all that God promised to Abraham was still available to them as heirs. The final context is Jesus, Paul, the early believers, they were in the Roman Empire. And we hear a lot about Rome these days, especially the fall of Rome. But I'm not sure we really understand what life was like on a daily basis in Rome. Rome was utterly dominant. I'm not sure that there's any country in our world today that has the same political, economic, and military dominance. Even the United States, I don't think, compares to what Rome had in their community, in their part of the world at this time. They maintained their power through tremendous violence, and it was not just the violence of the army coming through and smashing everything up like they did with the temple in AD 70 after Jesus was gone, and shortly before the Gospel of Mark was written. There was a violence on the personal level because they had another thing, was a rigid social hierarchy. There was 8 or 9 different levels of who people were organized into. And there was no way to move from one level to another. There was no upward social mobility like we think we have here in the United States. You were stuck where you were born, and that was it. And the higher level elites used their own personal ability of violence to maintain the people in their household, in their community, in their proper places. So when we're looking at this ancient group of new believers in Thessalonica, people would be gathering in this amphitheater to worship, to see plays and circuses, to gather as a community. But when you became a follower of Jesus, you weren't really welcome at that amphitheater anymore. You weren't welcome in your family. All of your social connections were broken. You didn't believe the emperor was God, so you were in kind of a little trouble that sometimes was full-blown persecution, sometimes it was just annoying oppression. But every part of your life became different when you became a follower of Jesus, because nothing about following Jesus fit with the Roman Empire at this time. Next slide. Now, some of you are saying, 1 Thessalonians, I'm not sure I've even ever heard of this book in the Bible. It's not one that's read very often or referred to very often. It doesn't have a huge influence. What it is a pastoral letter offering support and encouraging people who are struggling with the persecution of being new believers. The message is to encourage and support each other. That Jesus is standing with you. Jesus is going to come back. You are taken care of by God. It acknowledges that following Jesus is hard. This new way of life is not easy. Now, there is one section of this book that some people in the last 150 years have started reading a lot more, and it's the end of chapter 4. And it addresses the concern that people who have died in Thessalonica, believers who have died, will not be around when Jesus returns. Paul is addressing a pastoral concern of real fears of anxiety, and he's offering hope and comfort. Because in reality, Paul was so excited by Jesus, he was so passionate about the transformation that Jesus brings to people's lives, that he believed that Jesus was coming soon, that he himself would see the return of Jesus in his own life. And he figured most people alive were going to see Jesus come back. And he was really excited about this, and so then people are like, yeah, but my brother in faith, my sister in faith just died. They're not going to see Jesus. What's going to happen to them? Paul's like, don't worry. Everyone's going to be lifted up. Jesus will be with everyone. Paul offered pastoral comfort to people under persecution. The thing is, this last chapter, or the last section of chapter 4, there are 5 chapters in the book, has now been used to talk about something called the rapture. Some of you might be familiar with the Left Behind books and movies that were popular a few years ago. There's this branch of Christianity that talks a lot about this rapture that is coming soon is going to be this time where holy, pure people are going to be whisked away to heaven, leaving other people behind. And there's going to be a 7-year period, and then maybe some more people will be accepted into heaven. The thing is, a lot of people have gotten very nervous about the rapture. Am I going to be one of the people taken? Am I going to be with Jesus? The thing is, this is not a tradition of Christianity or an ancient belief. It started in the 1800s with a guy named John Nelson Darby. The whole rapture thing is 150 years old. It is popular in a couple branches of evangelical and Pentecostal Christianity. And this is about the only section of Thessalonians that a lot of people even think about much these days, even though it is a very calming and pastoral book. And so this leads me to the other thing I want to talk about today, because I think this sets the groundwork for moving into the New Testament. How do we interpret the Bible? There's a group of people that is looking for certainty, for black and white, clear answers. And they're like, every word in the Bible is absolutely true, and they're all equal to each other. Well, then what do you do with this section where clearly Paul is wrong? Jesus did not show up in their lifetime. Does that mean we throw out everything Paul said? Because one thing's wrong? Or is there another way of looking at interpreting the Bible where we have to spend time wrestling and trying to figure out there is a divine inspiration that led someone to write this down? And this was a profound experience for them with an important message for their community. What is the inspiration, the divine inspiration that we can take from their experience and their context and apply to our life today? Now, when you look at the graphic I have, someone's clearly trying to jam God into the Bible. Come on, God, you just have to fit in there. Are we reading the Bible and trying to fit our understanding of God into the limitations of a book? Or are we taking the Bible and letting the Spirit inspire us to see God at work in new ways in our world? Do we think God is still speaking to us and people around us today? Are we trying to figure out who God is in our lives and how we all fit together? So I think Thessalonians shows us the ways that the early church encouraged and comforted each other. And I think there are ways that the Bible can continue to comfort us today. And I think it also shows us that there are things that are tough to read in there that don't always make sense. And I think it encourages us to come together as a community of believers, just like those early believers did, and try to figure this stuff out together. Try to be in the Spirit, try to listen for God's voice, try to see where God is at work today. Let's take 3 minutes and have some conversations among ourselves. If we were online, we would do this in the chat room as well, but that's not working today, so today we'll just do it in person here. There'll be a timer started in a minute here, because I know these are topics that we could go far longer than 3 minutes, and you're certainly encouraged to continue the conversation after church today. But, you can talk about whatever you want, but perhaps some prompts would be, where are the times that you have found comfort in the Bible, and are you struggling with the ways to interpret and understand God through the Bible today? Oh, it's always so sad to get the 3 minutes done and want to just keep going. So please do continue the conversation. Feel free to have lunch together, get together during the week, and continue talking. I just heard a great comment from one group about tolerating the mystery and just, being in that space of just not having all the answers all the time. So as we walk with Jesus this summer, let's listen to Paul's instruction along our journey. He provided a radical message to a new faith community to love one another, encourage and support everyone at all times. This went against Jewish tradition, which placed God's chosen people above everyone else, and it went against Roman tradition, which placed family and village and citizenship above other people. So can we love one another today? Can we love people we disagree with or who disagree with us? Can we be beacons of hope in our culture today? As we go this week, I invite all of you to receive the pastoral comfort of Paul for whatever struggles you face as you live in the faith of Jesus Christ. Amen.